Hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation about APIs and OpenAPI in the age of AI. That's a lot of A's in the title, but that's how it is. My name is Erik Wilde. I work for INNOQ as a principal consultant, and I also work with the OpenAPI initiative as an ambassador, trying to promote standards, help people to understand the value of standards, and help people to understand how standards help them to get their jobs done. And let's move on to talk about what we will cover today. So I want to start by talking a little bit about why AI is relevant in the API space. I want to talk a little bit about, generally speaking, why OpenAPI and API description formats matter more than ever today. And then I want to dive a little deeper and talk about what we may see in the standard space happening and how it may affect you as somebody using APIs and probably thinking about AI and how that will maybe develop over the next year or so in the API space. Let's get started by just looking at what AI really means for APIs. So I'm an Apidays regular. I recorded this video, which, by the way, you can check out on YouTube. If you're interested in APIs, check out my YouTube channel. It's called Getting APIs to Work. I publish a lot of stuff about APIs. This one is one of those videos. I recorded it at Apidays New York back in May, a few months ago. And I asked people, what does AI change when it comes to APIs? Do we have to care? Do we have to panic? What it is that we have to do? And it was interesting to see the reactions. You could sort of put them on a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you would have people who very coolly basically say, nah, it's just another client, right? It's like nothing really changes, let's say, for the APIs, because APIs always were meant for consumption by machines, and AI is just another type of machine, so it's really not such a big deal. That's the very cool end of the spectrum. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where people get super excited about AI and say, oh, AI is changing everything and we don't even need APIs anymore. We're going to do everything with AI. And these are the two ends of the spectrum. Personally, I think we're somewhere in the middle. I think AI is a little bit more important than just being another client. But I still think that APIs will remain very important. And I want to talk about how that may affect us as practitioners in the API space. But before we get into that, I just want to remind you a little bit about the importance of API descriptions. So when you think of API descriptions, it's a description of an API that can be consumed by a number of people. And what's really important is to always keep in mind that whatever it is you're doing, you're probably only doing one of the things that is relevant and important for the APIs that you work with. And if you describe APIs, then various people can benefit. And I want to just move a little bit through all the different parties involved with APIs and point out that getting those together, giving them a shared language that they can work with is very valuable. And you will see that the different sets of people are relatively distinct. So let's go through those. And I've framed those in the form of user stories. And I have 4 of them. So first one, user story is, and I've always put like a book there that you might be interested to check out. So this one's called Unbundling the Enterprise by Steve Fishman and Matthew Larty. And this one is really strategic, right? It points out that APIs have a high strategic value. So from that point of view, you could say, as a business or organization leader, I want well-defined and usable digital interfaces for partner-centered public so that I can more easily change and scale my value streams, right? This is a very strategic view of APIs where you're saying, well, and if these are well-defined interfaces, they probably should be described in some shape or form. Maybe something like OpenAPI could help. Next story, next persona. And this one is another book, in that case by Erik Wilde, who talks more from the angle of developers of APIs, so people actually developing the capabilities. As an API developer, I want to describe the product I'm going to implement so that I can use various tools throughout the API lifecycle. So for example, if I am implementing an API, I can probably use tools just to edit an API description. I can probably use tools to generate code for me as a starting point. I can use tools to test my implementation. I can use tools to put up mocks so that others can already play around with the API even though it hasn't been implemented. So that's another class of API people, let's say, who might find API descriptions very valuable. Let's move on. The third user story I have are API consumers. So not the ones producing APIs, but the ones consuming APIs. And here we could say, as an API consumer, I want APIs to have standardized descriptions so that I can easily understand and consume the products I am accessing. Right? So if you're using APIs, it's very helpful if not every API is totally different from the others, but there's a certain similarity. So that allows you to more easily understand how they work, to start using tooling that you can reuse across a variety of APIs. And again, this is something where you would benefit a lot if there is kind of a shared language that those APIs are using to expose their capabilities. Now, so far we were more talking about individual APIs, and now let's move on to my last user story where API descriptions matters, which are, you could say, platform people. So more and more we see organizations, very rightly so, caring a lot about their API landscapes. So what are API landscapes? It's basically just a collection of APIs that you provide that hopefully is managed in a way that there are some similarities, you make them available, you make them findable, you make it easy for people to consume those APIs. And more there are job roles, there are whole teams whose job it is to make sure that these API platforms deliver value and are useful within organizations. And for those, you could come up with a story such as an API platform person, I want to support standardized description formats so that all producers and consumers speak in the same language. Right? Again, this is a very simple case where you could say, if I have 100 APIs, the more they function broadly in similar ways, the easier it is for somebody to consume a number of these APIs. They don't have to relearn everything every time they're starting to use a new API. They just have to learn the specific things about that API, but general mechanics, for example, such as error messages and these kind of things, just work in the same way in every single API. That's very useful. Okay, so as we've seen, there are a lot of points to be made where API descriptions are very useful. And what I'm arguing for is to say that we probably will be updating a little bit the way how we deal with API descriptions in the age of AI consumers. Why is that the case? So when you look at AI and when you look at what an OpenAPI description is, you could argue that it's like a description that an AI could read, but on the other hand, you could also say it's really not all that informative sometimes, right? You may have a whole big list of endpoints and the API description doesn't really tell you much in terms of how, for example, to combine these endpoints into something meaningful. So from one point of view, you could argue that instead of looking at a menu of different dishes that you can have at a restaurant, you actually have a menu just of ingredients, right? If you went to a restaurant and you would look at the menu and it would say, we have milk and wheat and rice and water and butter, right? That would not be what you expect. You want something that you can consume. You want a whole meal. But that's not really, so to speak, what OpenAPI gives you. OpenAPI gives you the ingredients and you have to understand how to combine them. And that's, I think, a little bit the direction in which we will have to go to be a little bit more explicit and a little bit more rich in the way how we describe APIs. So we can look at OpenAPI, in my mind, as a robust foundation. So it gives us things such as paths, operations, schemas, parameters and examples, gives us tags and grouping, it gives us security schemes, it gives us external documentation or pointers to external documentation, it gives us the link mechanism. So there are a number of these aspects about APIs that are very, very useful. And they are the reason why OpenAPI is popular, because these are useful and meaningful concepts. But again, we are lacking a little bit of the higher picture of what the API really is all about, right? So what does AI need? What AI really needs, like every API consumer, but AI may need it in a slightly different way because it may want to use the APIs in a slightly different way. So the idea would be that what's the intent and the purpose of an API? Why does it even exist? What can I get done with it? And then what are typical ways to use that API? What is the sequence of interactions that gets me to a meaningful result when I work with that API? Also, what are maybe possible side effects? If I try something, can I try the same thing again? Or is that something where I have to be careful? If I tried something and something goes wrong on my side, can I reverse the effect of that? So kind of maybe not, let's not call it transactional, but this idea of better understanding of where I have to be careful and where maybe I can be a little more aggressive in terms of using the API, because I know that nothing wrong will happen if something goes wrong along the way. And another thing that's important is the semantics of the outcome. So what does it mean to do these 10 interactions? What do I get in the end? Like what's the outcome of the overall interaction? And then also things that allow me as an AI to maybe better understand, should I use this over this? If there are two similar ways to get something done, when should I do this? When should I do that? Are there ways for me to better understand, like this is the standard procedure, this is this procedure in special cases? So again, that's something that maybe humans can sometimes more easily understand. And if we had more explicit signals, then this is something where AI could make better use of APIs. So when we look at those foundations of OpenAPI and at what AI really needs, we could clearly come up with a list of gaps where OpenAPI doesn't really give us yet what we need. Right? So we don't really have this idea of intent and purpose where OpenAPI would explain to us why the API exists, what goals does the overall API satisfy, and not just what are the 300 endpoints in it. Right? What are sequences and flows of interactions throughout the API, not just what requests can I send and what responses do I have to expect, but also what is the series of interactions that actually makes sense. Questions of side effects. Do operations have side effects or not? Are they safe? Are they idempotent? When we talk about HTTP level semantics, that could be an interesting thing to signify in a more explicit way in the API description. Also, better describing what is the semantic meaning of the overall API, what are the things that in the end make sense on the business level when you look at this API and what it does. And also this question of how does that compare to maybe alternative ways of doing the same thing? When do I choose this over maybe the alternative? Are there easy ways to understand when to use that one and when to use that one when there are alternative ways you can get something done? Now, for all these things, I don't have the solution, sadly. I just wanted to point out that I think this is a really interesting development. But as somebody who works a lot with OpenAPI initiative, I want to point out that I think we have enough people now that are working in that space that it would make a lot of sense to try to answer these questions as a community and not just individually, right? Because when you look at it, the big advantage of answering these questions as a community is that you come up with new standards or extensions of existing standards, and then you can start solidifying these into tooling, right? Which would mean that we also get tooling that helps us to better address these gaps. And I think that's really where we have to go as a community to say, okay, we are all working on AI stuff. Maybe we should think about how to best address that, and then start working at filling in those gaps. And how could we do that? I think there are two fundamental ways we could go about it. One would be to say, okay, we could just add little OpenAPI extensions here and there, right? A little sprinkled here, a little sprinkle there, basically putting in extensions where we think they make sense. That would be relatively easy. It would allow us also to experiment with these extensions and see which ones maybe gain some traction, maybe which ones don't, right? So that, to some extent, would be very flexible, because we would have a good way of observing this ecosystem of extensions and see which ones stick, right? And then maybe start promoting those in future versions of the standard. But on the other hand, this also means we would have a harder time addressing issues that are not just like these isolated things, but larger ones, such as this whole workflow thing of how do I combine API interactions into something larger, something more meaningful. And at that point, you could argue that instead of adding these extensions into OpenAPI, maybe we need another layer on top of OpenAPI, one that is better, more meaningful, richer for AI, maybe not just for AI, but also for AI consumers. And for this, you could then have something that's a little bit more ambitious, that's a little richer. The advantage would be that you would have those things. It would be richer, it would be more ambitious. The disadvantage would be that it's also probably more opinionated, right? So if you get it right, everything's great. If you don't get it right, then you would have to say, okay, that didn't really work out the way we were hoping, right? But what's really interesting is, for those of you who haven't heard of it, there is a new specification by the OpenAPI initiative, which is called Arazzo. Arazzo has been around for a little over a year now, and it's a workflow specification that does exactly what I was talking about before. It combines different calls, let's say, of API endpoints into something larger. And that could be very, very interesting. And we already see some companies implementing Arazzo. We see them playing around with tooling that takes these workflows, and then this means that you can execute the workflows in a deterministic way, because it is described somewhere. So you take out some of the non-deterministic behavior of AI, but you still are able to give that to an AI and say, here is the workflow, how you order something. Now go and put it into action, right? Combine it with something else, but ordering always has to be done that way. And I think, to me, that sounds like a really attractive value proposition. We will see whether that turns out to be true or not. But for a standard that has only been around for a year or so, I think we do see good traction. And if you're interested in Arazzo, check it out. You can just Google, or you can check out the OpenAPI Initiative webpage, or you will find some videos on YouTube that tell you a little bit more how that standards work. But I'm really kind of bullish about that particular standard. I think it's a good fit for the problem that we have in front of us, but we'll see how it plays out. And another thing that we don't yet have is an easy way to say, are my APIs really AI ready, right? Do the APIs that I have satisfy all the criteria to be easily consumable by AI and AI agents? And again, this is something where we see first publications, first tooling coming out. Some of these are relatively simple. So something like, okay, you probably should have meaningful descriptions for all operations so that an LLM can kind of look at the description and understand what an operation is doing. But it also could be something a little bit more tricky, I would say, at the design level, where you would say maybe you want your resources to be more fine-grained so that you have more specific interactions that you can build into workflows that are deterministic. And you have a few more APIs, but you have more ways how to combine them into different workflows. And it's helpful to have that and not to have relatively coarse-grained APIs where you can do a lot, but it's harder to describe how to get something specifically done. Right? So I think these kind of design guidelines are still kind of developing, but it's something where I think also we will get more and more feedback, we will get more and more experience. And again, this could be something where the OpenAPI initiative could serve as a community place where people get together to answer these questions and then start building shared tooling around that. So I think that would be really nice. If you look at the things that I was talking about so far, you will figure out that yes, we probably don't have all the answers yet, but there's a lot of momentum in that space. And I think right now is a good moment in time to try to really leverage all that momentum and to get people to the point where they start collaborating around these goals and creating new standards or improving existing standards, in my mind, could be a very useful way of doing that, because then again, right, it can go down into that tooling layer where we then get tools that help us to do things at a better level of abstractions than we can do that now. And one last thing that I briefly want to talk about is, it's a little different, but it's also something that's dear to my heart because it's the same kind of thing where that actually would be addressed very nicely by a community of people using APIs. And here it's a little different. It's not the question of how do I make APIs available to AI-based applications, but it's more the question of if my implementation of an API uses AI technologies, maybe there are some things I would like to make explicit. And these things could be such as just saying, okay, this is a service that uses AI tooling. And some people then might say, okay, what does that mean? Maybe I want to understand what that means. And that could also mean that, for example, some of the responses of that service are a little less deterministic, as you would expect from, let's say, a more traditionally implemented service, because there's an LLM behind it and a model, and the model may change, and I may get different responses, and that may be totally fine. But it's something that maybe I want to know about. And you might also be interested, what kind of model are you using? Can I maybe select the model that you're using? Or if I can't, at least let me know which model you're using so that, for example, I can also understand when you switch models and suddenly the behavior changes. And the explanation for that is because it's a different model now. And that is something maybe I want to learn about. And another thing I might be interested in is, are you using my input to train your model? Is that may be totally okay? Maybe it's not okay. Maybe it's not even legal for me to do that then, because there's some personally identifiable data that I do not want to be used in that way, right? So that's another little annotation that would be very helpful. So overall, I think we can expect that better understanding whether in a service that I'm using AI plays a significant role or not, that might become more important. And that, again, could be something where you have a standardized description format that basically, in the same way as on any other product, right, it would say, may contain peanuts. And here it would say, does contain AI. And then you can choose whether you like that or not, and kind of maybe make a different selection of services. Right? So I think it, again, could be something that we as a community might want to figure out. What would be the interesting signals that we want, right? Do we want to know whether it contains peanuts or not, because we have decided that it's important? And I think the same could be said for that kind of content of services that is relevant there. And again, I think this is something where, as a community, that would be the best place for us to develop those things, and then to have a shared model how we expose those things, so that we don't have 50 different ways that all are slightly different, but instead we have one and everybody understand what it means. And one last pitch for an OpenAPI initiative specification, if we have that, then we could use another specification. So the OpenAPI initiative now has 3 specifications: the OpenAPI itself, then the Orazio workflow specification that I was mentioning already, and then the overlays specification, which is something where you can, it's basically like a patch format for OpenAPI descriptions. So you could take an OpenAPI description and, for example, add in certain information that you need to add in, such as, well, this is using AI and here's what it is using. Or you could strip certain information and, for example, say my API has 50 endpoints, but to those agents over there, I only want to expose 20 of those 50, and then overlays allow you to easily do that. And again, I think what we see here is we see a really interesting ecosystem emerging around specifications, how we work with them, and descriptions of APIs. And I think just looking at that ecosystem and seeing how it develops and evolves is something that, as a practitioner, should be something that you do every now and then, right? We all have other things to do as well. I understand that. But I think if that gets to the level where we get tooling out of it, that may very well make your life easier and everybody else's life easier. So let me end by saying that what I think is really important to keep in mind is that the more APIs we have and the more APIs users we see, such as AI applications, the more it becomes important that we have a shared foundation that we work with. The OpenAPI specification has become such a shared foundation. There are many, many, many tools using OpenAPI, and I think the same will happen in some shape or form with AI-oriented tools. The OpenAPI initiative is an open organization. You don't have to be a member. You don't have to pay any dues. Anybody can join conversations and discussions. We have a lot of active participation, but the more people are participating, the better it will be for the community. So at the very least, check out what OAI is doing. Maybe you can get something out of that. And if not, then at least maybe next year we have something for you if some of the things that I was mentioning in this presentation is actually developing. We will get some descriptions that are more AI oriented, and then we will get some tooling, and then everybody's happy. Okay, and with that, I am done. Like I said in the beginning, I do have a YouTube channel where I talk about APIs a whole lot. If you are interested in APIs, check it out. It's called Getting APIs to Work. I'm also pretty active on LinkedIn. Please connect if you haven't done so far. And I am also open with my slides, meaning that if you want to look at that presentation online, you can find it at the link that you see here. That's it for today. Thanks a lot for listening, and see you at one of the next API Days events. Bye, everybody.